For more than 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine has stood like a watchman over the Western Hemisphere, a quiet but unyielding guardian of the American Republic. It was born in an age when kings still ruled most of the world, when empires stretched their hands across oceans, and when the United States, young, determined, and still recovering from the trials of its early years, understood that survival required more than courage. It required clarity, it required resolve, and it required a declaration that the Western Hemisphere would never again be a chessboard for foreign powers. Today, in the headlines of 2026, that old sentinel has awakened again. President Donald Trump, following the dramatic U.S. operation that removed Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro from power, has invoked the doctrine with renewed force, even giving his own name to its modern interpretation, calling it the, quote, Monroe Doctrine. The world watches as the United States once again asserts that this hemisphere, our hemisphere, is not open for foreign interference. But to understand why this moment matters, we must return to the beginning, to James Monroe, to the fragile young republic, and to the moment when America first declared that the Western Hemisphere would be free. When James Monroe took office in 1817, the United States was still a nation in its adolescence. The scars of the War of 1812 were fresh. Washington, D.C. had been burned. The Republic had survived, but only just. Monroe understood that the United States could not afford to be drawn again into the rivalries of Europe. The Atlantic Ocean was wide, but not wide enough to keep the ambitions of kings at bay. Across Latin America, revolutions were breaking out like brush fires. Nations long held under Spanish rule were fighting for independence. Their struggle stirred American sympathies, for the United States saw in them a reflection of its own birth. But the crowned heads of Europe saw something different. They saw instability, they saw opportunity, and they began to whisper of restoring the old colonial order. Monroe knew that if Europe returned to the Americas with armies and fleets, the United States would be next. The Republic needed breathing room. It needed security, and it needed a declaration that would make the intentions of the United States unmistakable. James Monroe was not a man who theorized about liberty from a distance. He had fought for it. As a young soldier, he crossed the Delaware with Washington and was wounded at Trenton. He had served as a diplomat in France during the Revolution, witnessing firsthand the turbulence of nations struggling to define themselves. He helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, expanding the Republic's territory and securing its future. He served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, sometimes at the same time, guiding the nation through crisis. By the time he became the 5th President of the United States, Monroe had lived the full arc of the American experiment, from its desperate beginnings to its hopeful rise. He believed deeply that the Republic must remain free from foreign domination, and that the Western Hemisphere must not become a battleground for European ambition. On December 2, 1823, Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress. Within that message, almost quietly, without fanfare, he laid down a principle that would shape the destiny of the hemisphere. He declared that the American continents were no longer open to colonization. He warned that any attempt by European powers to extend their political systems to the Western Hemisphere would be considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. And he made clear that the United States would not interfere in European affairs, so long as Europe stayed out of the Americas. It was a bold statement for a nation that did not yet possess the military strength to enforce it, but it was backed by conviction, by principle, and by the growing sense that the Western Hemisphere was a family of nations that deserved to chart their own course. Historians today still describe Monroe's declaration as a cornerstone of American foreign policy, a doctrine that would become a mainstay of U.S. strategy for generations. As the United States grew, the Monroe Doctrine grew with it. It was invoked to deter European recolonization in the 19th century. It was expanded by Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century, who argued that the United States had a responsibility to maintain order in the hemisphere. During the Cold War, it became a shield against Soviet influence in Cuba and beyond. And even in the 21st century, long after some declared it obsolete, the doctrine remained a quiet but persistent force in American policy. Administrations came and went, interpretations shifted, but the core principle endured. The Western Hemisphere must remain free from foreign domination. In January 2026, the Monroe Doctrine returned to the forefront of American foreign policy with startling clarity. The United States launched a dramatic operation that resulted in the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, who was transported to New York to face charges of narco-terrorism. President Trump, speaking afterward, declared that the mission was justified under the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, arguing that Maduro had allowed, quote, foreign adversaries into the region and acquired, quote, menacing offensive weapons that threatened American lives. Trump went further, saying that the doctrine had been revived and expanded, and that some were now calling it the Monroe Doctrine. The State Department echoed this sentiment, declaring publicly that, quote, this is our hemisphere, and President Trump will not allow our security to be threatened, end quote. News outlets across the world took notice. Time magazine reported that Trump was reasserting the doctrine as a guiding principle for American action in the hemisphere. NBC News and PBS both noted that the doctrine, far from being a relic, was being used as justification for one of the most dramatic foreign policy operations in recent memory. The Financial Express explained that the doctrine still underpins U.S. opposition to external influence in the Western Hemisphere, and that its legacy remains central to American strategy. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine is not history. It is present. The Monroe Doctrine is not a statute. It's not a treaty. It's a declaration of national interest, rooted in the President's constitutional authority over foreign policy and reinforced by 2 centuries of precedent. Its power comes from its longevity, its clarity, and the willingness of American leaders to enforce it when necessary. Modern applications of the doctrine draw upon the President's Article II powers, the War Powers Resolution, and the international law regarding hostile foreign interference. When President Trump invoked the doctrine in 2026, he did so as part of a broader argument that the United States has both the right and the responsibility to prevent foreign militarization in the hemisphere, a position consistent with the doctrine's original intent. The Monroe Doctrine shapes American policy today in ways Monroe could have never imagined. Foreign military presence in the hemisphere is viewed with suspicion. Cyber operations launched from foreign-backed groups in the Americas are treated as national security threats. Economic influence by adversarial nations is scrutinized for its strategic implications. And regional instability, whether caused by criminal networks, hostile governments, or foreign actors, invites American attention. The doctrine provides a framework for understanding these challenges. It reminds the Republic that its security begins close to home, and it asserts that the United States has a unique role in preserving peace and stability in the hemisphere. At its heart, the Monroe Doctrine is not about conquest, it's about guardianship. It's about ensuring that the Western Hemisphere remains a region of free nations, each charting its own destiny without fear of foreign domination. It's about preserving the sovereignty of the American Republic and protecting the peace of the hemisphere. James Monroe understood that a free republic must defend its own neighborhood. President Trump, in invoking the doctrine today, argues that the same principles applies in an age of missiles, cyber warfare, and global adversaries. The tools have changed, the threats have evolved, but the duty remains. The Monroe Doctrine began as a warning. It became a shield. And today it stands as a reminder that the American Republic has both the right and the responsibility to defend the Western Hemisphere from foreign interference. James Monroe could not have foreseen the world of 2026, but he understood something timeless, that liberty must be protected, that sovereignty must be guarded, and that a republic must never allow foreign powers to shape its destiny. 2 centuries later, the sentinel he set upon the shores of the Western Hemisphere still stands watch.